So you're self-employed and you want to figure out retirement for yourself. So there are two common options. I'm going to break down today specifically the pros and cons of each of these options, the 4 scenarios that are pretty common and then which option to select, and then also the math breakdown, side-by-side comparison. I'm going to let you decide what makes more sense for you. I will say the solo 401k for myself is one thing I love. It's exactly what we specifically use. My wife and I actually have a solo 401k for our small business, but the SEP IRA is also a good alternative. So I'm going to walk through the pros and cons of each to start, and we're going to start with the solo 401k. So the solo 401k has higher contribution limits than the SEP IRA, technically speaking. So this allows both employee and employer contributions. So let's stop there and let's break that down. When you are self-employed, you are now considered the employer and the employee. So there's different metrics or numbers for each one of these things, and we'll get to the details in a second. But this can result in higher total contributions than the SEP IRA, and I'll show you that in the math breakdown shortly. But the max is $70,000. So typically you can contribute more with the solo 401k. For anybody that you guys see in the video behind me, we have people installing our dehumidifiers today, so all good there. Secondly, one of the pros of the solo 401k is the catch-up contributions. So if you're 50 plus, this is relevant for you. So if you're below 50, it's not relevant, but eventually you will be above 50, hopefully. And so you can actually contribute an extra $7,500 as an employee. If you're over 50, that's the case. But if you're between 60 and 63 in particular, you can actually contribute an extra $11,250, which is a new part of the rule going forward. So that could change. Obviously, all this could be subject to change, but as of today, if you're between 60 and 63, that number is $11,250 extra, which is a really huge amount of money. The next option, or the next benefit and pro, is the Roth option. So this is where I really like this. This can include a Roth 401k feature, allowing for tax-free withdrawals in retirement. So the SEP IRA does not have the same exact option as the solo 401k. So when you go into your solo 401k portal, you have the option to be employee or employer contribution, and also Roth or pre-tax contribution. So you have a lot of flexibility here, a lot of optionality. That's why I love this one. I actually don't use the Roth, to be honest. I use a lot of the pre-tax side of things for our personal solo 401k for just our situation, but it does have the option. I can flip that whenever I want, which is really cool. The next option, which I'm not a huge benefit, or I'm not a huge fan of this, but it is a pro nonetheless. Technically speaking, you can loan or you can borrow from the account. So you can, just like similar to a 401k loan as well, for a standard, employer one that you have through a W-2, you can loan up to or borrow up to $50,000 or 50% of your balance. Now with the solo 401k, obviously you're self-employed. Now with a W-2, for if you're listening to this and you happen to be W-2, or you have a spouse that's W-2, the reason I don't like this is because if you leave that job, you get terminated or whatnot, you have to pay that loan back right away. And so that can be extremely, put you in a hole really quickly if you don't prepare for that. So those are the pros of the solo 401k. There's a lot of options from a contribution limit. You can do a lot of optionality from a Roth or traditional option, employer, employee. You can loan, you have catch-up contributions, all that kind of stuff. Now the cons on this one, again, they aren't like huge cons in my opinion, but more administrative work for sure. So once you have over $250,000 in assets, you have to file Form 5500 EZ, which I'm very familiar with from my Deloitte days when we did benefit plans at my different clients that we did. So we always would obviously work with the 5500s. So I'm very familiar with that form, unfortunately, but this is something you'll have to do once you reach $250,000 in assets. Also, potentially higher fees. So it depends. Like if you use something like Carry, I'll provide a link in the show notes below for the one that I use individually. Carry is a phenomenal solo 401k provider, and I think they're the best on the market. In fact, I was with Vanguard, up to 2024, mid 2024, but they actually sold their whole entire small business retirement plan to, I think it's a Census. So I had no reason to stay with the Census, and therefore I was looking for other options. I kind of did a rundown of the entire market. I looked at Charles Schwab, Fidelity. All of those had pros and cons, but the best option across the board was 100% Carry, which is obviously why I use them. And I have a lot of students actually using Carry as well. The next thing is less flexibility for employees. If you add employees other than a spouse, you'll need to convert to a regular 401k. So once you start building your business, or you don't have 1099 like contractors within the business, it starts to get a lot more challenging to use the solo 401k in general. So that's something to note as well. Now the SEP IRA, let's look at the pros and cons here. So this is a higher contribution limit, allows employer contributions up to 25% of compensation, capped at $70,000. So they both have the max being $70,000, but I'll show you the math as to why it typically does not work out to be more beneficial because you don't have the employee contributions. Remember, this allows employer contributions, which is a big difference. So you have to make a lot of money essentially to get to that $70,000 cap. And not everybody's making a ton of money in their small business. Obviously, the average small business does not make that much money in America. So the next pro is easy setup and administration. So simple to establish with minimal paperwork. It's a really easy thing to do. It takes like 3 seconds. The flexible contributions, you can adjust or skip contributions each year. You can kind of do that within the solo off. You can obviously change and, adjust that kind of stuff. The cool thing about the SEP is there's no payroll requirement. So contributions are based on net earnings, making it flexible for solo business owners, which is really nice pro as well. The cons of this is employer, like I said, only contributions. So no separate employee contributions, which is a big deal here. Like that's a big deal. And you'll understand when I show you guys the math as to what the difference could be based on a very simplified example here. So no extra tax deferred savings options here. So of course, not everybody like cares for a ton of money in this account. Some people do, some people don't. I like it. I like to max it out on the employee side at a bare minimum, but also having the options of employee and employer goes a very long way. The other option, there's no Roth. So you don't have flexibility here. You have the employer only and no Roth option. So that limits you to 2 of the 4 total options that the solo 401k will provide all. So I kind of look at the solo 401k as like the new account, the new hybrid account, the new guy in the block type deal. And then lastly is it's less ideal for employees. So if you hire workers, you must contribute the same percentage of salary for them as yourself. That's a really, really costly thing. Obviously you want to do good by your employees and all that kind of stuff, but you don't have the flexibility to decide as much. So that's a huge con of the SEP IRA. And those are the pros and cons. Now let's get into the 4 scenarios that are pretty common. So if you want to maximize your tax advantage savings, it's definitely the solo 401k. So the goal is to put as much money as way in a tax advantage vehicle, which is the solo 401k up to $70,000. You definitely want to roll with the solo 401k because there's higher contribution potential. Number 2 is if you prefer simple setup with fewer admin requirements, I would go with the SEP IRA. Now, I'm not saying that I would do that just because of that, but if that's like a big sticking point for you, it would be technically easier. I still don't think solo 401k is like that big of a deal, especially under $250,000 in assets before the 5,500 form becomes relevant. Number 3, if you want Roth contributions or loan access, like we talked about, you have to go solo 401k because the SEP does not have that option. And so again, this is a big sticking point for a lot of people as well, having the Roth option. If you're a W-2, you most likely have a Roth at your 401k at work, but when you're a self-employed individual, you have to select the type of plan so that you have that option. Number 4, common scenario, the 4th one is if you have employees or you may be hiring soon, the SEP IRA might make sense from an easier compliance standpoint. So these are 4 things that like everybody asks me. So I brought these specific options up because I know this will come up in most scenarios or people listening. Now, the next option or the next breakdown is the math breakdown. So this is a side-by-side comparison. This is phenomenal. So the solo 401k is over here. Let's look at this number and then look at this number after this. So the rules behind the solo 401k calculation, okay? Employee, and I made sure I highlighted essentially the employee side of things. So up to $23,500 or 100% of compensation, whichever is less. So if you're age 50 or older, you can make additional catch-up contributions of $7,500, or obviously, remember, like we talked about, if you're between 60 and 63, it's actually $11,250. So when you're really old and you're about to croak over, you have the option. Next is the employer contribution. So you have up to 25% of compensation. However, for self-employed individuals, this is effectively 20% of net earnings after adjusting for self-employment tax. Let's go over to the rule here before we show the math as well. So in the SEP IRA, only employer contributions allowed up to 25% of compensation with a maximum limit of $70,000. So let's do a breakdown of this. I'm going to show you specifically how this plays out. So let's say the net income of this business, whether you select solo 401k or SEP IRA, is $90,000. So we're talking net income. Let's be very specific about that because I think there's even a confusion around what net income is or net earnings. So your income, your gross income, how much you make in total minus your expenses is your net income. So you're starting there after expenses, what you're actually taking home type deal. So your net income, let's say it's $90,000. That's what you're taxed on. So if I make $90,000, I'm going to begin to be taxed on $90,000. Let's say my business makes $200,000, but I have $110,000 expenses. So I'm not taxed on $200,000. I'm taxed on $90,000, which is $200,000 minus $110,000. So that is my beginning taxable amount or my net income that then is paid out to me after we take care of other stuff. This self-employment tax is really important. So like I said, at W-2, you're basically paying the 7.65% on your paycheck. Your employer's taking care of the other 7.65%. And so when you're talking about S Corps, potentially, or solopreneurs or whatever, like single member LLCs, the difference there is that like most of your W-2 income, or whatever's considered your W-2 income, which I'm not getting into today, would be all taxed at the full self-employment tax number. So what Mr. Kohler says, Mark Kohler, he says the F word, the FICA tax. You the big F word. You don't want to have that. And so that's why the whole S Corp conversation is very relevant. But for the self-employment tax, in line with the rules up here, you have to take out half of that, right? So you take your total net income and you deduct 7.65%, which happens in this situation to be $6,885, which gets you to a true net earnings of $83,115. So the employer contribution on this side, again up here, self-employed individuals, this is effectively 20% of net earnings after adjusting for self-employment tax, is $16,623, whereas the employer contribution on the SEP is actually a little higher. So this is where it says with a potential of more earnings. When we go back to the pros and cons, I want to point this out. So if I'm looking at this, it's saying, you know, there's potentially higher contribution limits. And I say here, potential right here as well, because there's other situations where you just do employer, or like there's not an employee contribution and things of that nature. So technically speaking, if you stop there, the SEP IRA would have a higher contribution limit. Now, when you get down here, I obviously pulled down the employer contributions right here for you. So 16,000 just pulls down here. And then over here, the 20,000 pulls down here. Now, here's where the solo 401k is much better. So the catch-up contribution is available at the employee level. It's not available here because there is no employee contribution. So here we have literally $0. Over here, we have $23,500 because that is the 100% of compensation. So assuming that you're making a good amount of money, especially in this situation, 90,000, you should be good to do the full 23.5. Not to say you have to. And the catch-up contribution is available. So if you're making more money at your job and you're over 50 years old and you want to contribute more, this option is available here, which is awesome. This is a really, really good benefit. Again, going back to the pros and cons to kind of link it, higher contribution like we're talking about, catch-up contributions. There's also the Roth option now here in this situation that you can use and do a Roth versus traditional. So there's a lot of things at play here, which is really, really cool. And then lastly, as you can see here, is the totals is $40,000 for the solo in this example, and it's only $20,000 in this example, almost a $20,000 difference, $19,000 difference. So again, there's a lot of pros and cons. There's a lot of scenarios that could be present for you with the solo 401k or SEP IRA, but ultimately you're trying to invest as a self-employed individual in a retirement option. Both of these options are good, but now that you have actually the side-by-side comparison, you have all the pros and cons, you have some common scenarios that pop up, you should be able to make your own decision what makes sense for you. So I hope this really helped give you a good breakdown. I'm going to do some more self-employed, maybe a solopreneur versus S Corp type of conversations in the future. And I hope you guys enjoy this, and I will see you next week.